All right. So thank you to Rose for being our featured speaker. We're going to start with Kiddush. Really feels weird to do like hamot or for the bread when it's not really bread, but whatever. So I couldn't find the right one, so I'm just going to do the regular Friday night. Same thing. Yom HaShishi vayechul HaShamayim v'aretz v'chol tzva'am vayechal Elohim b'yom hashvi'i melachto asher asah vayishbot b'yom hashvi'i mikol melachto asher asah vayivarech Elohim b'yom hashvi'i vayikadesh oto ki bo shama mikol melachto asher b'ro melosot sabrei mornan brochatanan machalam borei pri agapen brochatanan machalam asher kedeshana b'mitzvotav v'eretzavanu v'shabbat kodsho v'yavav v'ratzon hinchelanu zikaron l'masei bereshit techilanu mikrei kodesh letzad Mitzrayim. כי בנו בחרתם ואותנו קדשנו מכל עמים בשבת קדשך באהבה ורצון הנחלתנו ברוך אתה מקדש השבת.
And then say and Pesach.
And blessed Passover.
Amen.
Good job, Josh. And then fake bread, l'chaim. All right.
Hi everybody, my name is Jen D. Silvestro. I'm the director of the Holocaust Learning Experience, which is a program through Morse Life Next Generation. It's my honor and privilege to be here tonight and to introduce Rose Rosenkranz, who is a volunteer in our program. She is a child survivor who is going to share her story with you tonight. So thank you Joshua for hosting, and thank you to the Federation for our partnership, and thank you Rose.
First question: Have any of you been on the March of the Living, or heard of the March of?
I've heard of it.
You've been on the march?
I went to a depressing trip to Poland. There was nothing happy at the end. It wasn't the official trip. I know, but normally March of the Living you end up in Israel.
Yeah.
Ours was like we did the March of the Living.
With which group?
We're from Winnipeg, Canada.
Oh, you did it with, okay.
With Morris Henoff and Roberta Malum.
Okay, I did it
Something like that.
18 times.
Y'all old. Nice, Josh.
Yeah, I've led it 18 times. So a lot of teens went through my fingers, but it's fabulous. Hopefully, it'll still be around. It started in '88. But, so you guys have kids, make sure they go. It changes everybody's life, right? It's life changing.
Is it subsidized?
What's that?
Is it subsidized?
Oh, yes, it has to be. Yeah.
It's only $2,000 and it's a
Yeah.
lot more.
Yeah. Okay, so I hope you don't mind. I have to put things down on paper, and you'll find out why I have to do some reading. I'll take questions at the end. But, so thank you for having me here tonight, and I'll begin. It's 1945. World War II ends, and two young Polish Jews could finally return to their homes after spending 5 horrific years in slave labor camps in Siberia and the Ukraine. They carried everything they owned, some clothes, pillows, a blanket, as well as a 1.5-year-old child who was born in that slave labor camp. I am that child. They miraculously survived in the bitter cold temperatures of 30 to 60 degrees below zero, near starvation, working in the forests, cutting down redwood trees, or rolling logs on the freezing rivers. They were anxious to return to their hometowns, and families hoping that the stories they continue to hear about the ghettos, starvation, disease, gas chambers, and crematoria were just that, stories. Unfortunately, they were not. Before my personal story, it's important to look at the whole picture through a timeline, as well as to help understand how Germany, the most cultured country in Europe, could perpetuate such a genocide. We need to go back to the end of World War I. So between 1919, when the war is over, to 1933, Germany's loss, they're forced to sign the Versailles Treaty, and they have reparations force the country into bankruptcy, economic depression, social upheaval, political uncertainty, everything ripe for a demagogue. So you have the rise of Nazism, with its promise to bring Germany back to its former glory, geographically, economically, and racially. Hitler uses the Jews as a scapegoat for Germany's defeat and problems. He played on people's hopes, fears, and prejudices. The Holocaust did not begin with gas chambers and crematoria, but with words. 1933, there's an election in Germany, and the Nazi Party gets 33% of the vote, more than any other party. So then President Hindenburg made Hitler chancellor, and with Hindenburg's death, Hitler becomes dictator, abolishes the parliament, and utilizes the brown shirts, the violent paramilitary units, or plain thugs, that assaulted Jews and other undesirables. 1934, a year later, Jewish book burnings, boycotts of Jewish stores, hundreds of anti-Semitic laws. You couldn't have any cars, you couldn't own any guns, bikes, furs, leather. You couldn't own a store. You couldn't teach. Jewish doctors couldn't treat non-Jews. Go to the cinema, parks, intermarry. 1935, you have the Nuremberg laws, which are racial laws, define people according to races. The Aryans were the highest, down to the Jews. The Jews were not even considered human, but subhuman, and they lost their German citizenship. In matter of fact, in 1936, the Summer Olympics were held in Munich, and Hitler wouldn't shake, you know who it was that raced? He was a black racer.
Jesse Owens?
Jesse Owens. He wouldn't shake his hand. He just walked off. 1938, Hitler goes outside the German borders and takes over Austria, parts of Czechoslovakia, claiming to unite the German-speaking countries, called Lebensraum. And something you might have heard of. November 9th and 10th, Kristallnacht. Anybody hear of Kristallnacht? This was the first time you have physical assaults. Jewish stores are broken into. Synagogues are burned, and 30,000 Jewish men are arrested and sent to concentration camps. Jews are blamed for it, and they're fined $400 million. And then they're responsible for cleaning up. I checked the articles in the New York Times because I collect old newspapers. They had articles on the first page. The day after, nothing at all. So 1935, there was a ship called the SS St. Louis. They made a movie out of it called Voyage of the Damned, in case anyone saw it. 937 men, women, and children from Germany were able to get visas to go to Cuba. But when they approached Cuba, the Cubans reneged and they were denied entry. So the ship went to Miami, up the coast, and the United States wouldn't take the refugees in. And they went all the way up to New York, hoping that some states would open the doors for them. And they landed up going back to Germany and fell into the Holocaust there. Also in 1939, there was a pact between Germany and Russia dividing Poland in half, saying that there'll be non-aggression between the two countries. And Hitler hated Stalin passionately, almost as much as he hated the Jews. And yet he made a pact with the Russians. Come September 1st, Germany invades Poland. World War II begins, and as my father tells me, as the Germans are entering the cities and the towns, they collect all the leaders, Jewish leaders, and they string them up. And the Jews are forced to watch this. They're beaten, they're picked up for work details, schools are closed. The Polish army fought, but loses in 3 weeks. England and France declare war on Germany and Italy. Now, the Jews that are living there all think, including my family, that the war will be over very quickly. Once England and France are involved, it'll go very quickly. So just have to hold on for just as a while. In 1940, the ghettos begin, the formation of the ghettos. The calories that are allotted each person is 180 calories a day. 8 to 10 people are put in one room. There's no heat. The coal is called black diamonds. There's no sanitation, or very lack of sanitation. And when 1941 comes, the invasion of Russia begins. So the Germans go against the pact and invade Russia. And with the invasion of Russia, right behind the soldiers come the units called Einsatzgruppen. And what they were to do is to seek out any Jews that were in hiding, take them into the forests, and assassinate them into mass graves. So the official beginning of the genocide begins in 1942. All this time, you didn't have any of the countries involved helping in any way. The Wannsee Conference in 1942, you have the final solution begins. The 6 death camps are established in Poland. Why there? Because that's where most of the Jews were. There were 3.5 million Jews, and they were in Poland. So why set up death camps anywhere else? It's easier to bring them all to Poland. And at the end, we all know that 6 out of 9 million Jews in Europe are killed. All the precursors to my family's story. Now, my father's story. My father was 19, the second of 7 children. Baby Miriam was born in August of 1939, just 1 week before the war begins. He and his older brother Abe decide to run to the east at the border with Russia because they were military age, and they thought, we'll hang out here for a couple weeks, the war will be over, and we'll go home. At the border with Russia, in Poland, Russia refused to give them temporary entry. My uncle returns to to the family and is put into the ghetto. My father gets jailed, thrown into a Russian jail to clean the latrines, and he gets beaten for about 6 weeks, put on a cattle train, and for a month, the trek up to Siberia. And he was one of the closest camps to the Arctic Circle in a place called Ukhta. Meanwhile, the rest of the family, or the rest of his family, are forced into the Lodz ghetto. Ghettos were really created in almost every town and city. And as I said, there were 8 to 10 people in one room. And so the disease was spreading, and as well as the starvation, and bodies were put on the sidewalks, and they were put on the sidewalks without clothes, because the clothes were needed for the living. So when I heard that my grandfather had died in the ghetto, I was said, oh my God, I hope they didn't put it out, on the sidewalk like that. It was just a horrible thought, but found out that they didn't. There were carts that went through the streets picking up the bodies, and this was every single day. My grandfather wanted to make sure that the rest of the family had food, so even though he had the ration of 180 calories a day, he gave it up. He gave it to his family, and he died of starvation, as well as his 13-year-old son. My father also had a sister, Ruth, and she was about 15, and they said, we're going to gather all the girls, and we're going to send you up to Sweden. This is what the Germans said. We'll send you up to Sweden. And so they volunteered to go, and they put them on a boat, on a ship, and it was in the harbor, and they blew it up. They blew up the ship, and it was just one of the stories that they said. My grandmother had the 2 children, the 1 month old, and that's okay. And she had a 4-year-old, and they asked for all the children to be given over. They collected they wanted all the children and the elderly, as they started to liquefy the ghettos, to pass all the people into Auschwitz. And so Grandma decided she was going to hide, and she took the 2 youngest, and there was an abandoned building, and she went up into the attic, and she was there almost till 1944, and the baby got sick, and she started to heat up some food for her, and the smoke went through the chimney, and the Nazis found her and put her on one of the last transports to Auschwitz. And because she was really worthless to work, because she had children. And my uncle, the 17-year-old, my father's 17-year-old brother, was on the transport as well, and he saw his mother and the 2 little ones taken into the undressing rooms at Auschwitz, and eventually gassed. When I go to Auschwitz, and I've been there 17, 18 times already. There is a railroad car there, and you can go into it, and you have to try to picture that 100 people were all pushed into this railroad car, and they were given up 2 pails. Each car was given 2 pails, one of water and one to use as a bathroom. And here you are standing still, 100 of people, and you need to use and it's over there. So how are you gonna manipulate? Or you need to get some water. Or people that are standing, their position is that they're standing near the pail. The smell of it, I mean, one way or the other, it was awful situation. And I would think to myself, well, what are the 2 little ones asking my grandmother? I'm thirsty, I'm hungry. The children, it just breaks your heart to think of what they experienced. And this was 5 days they kept them, and she was sent in August. So here, this enclosed car, the smell, the crowdiness, and the people died on the train itself, and they never made it to Auschwitz. And I guess they were the lucky ones, to tell you the truth. So when they got off the railroad car, there was a Nazi standing there, and very often it was a doctor named Mengele, and he would have his white gloves on, and he would go to the right or to the left, the men on one side, the women on the other side, and he would decide who lived and who died. And well, he was given the power of a god, really, So women were useless if they had children. If you were a teenager, you had a better chance of making it to the side of working, where you would go. They would take you to, you would go, and they would eventually give you a shower and your clothes, your uniform, your striped uniform. And those of you who were unlucky would go down the stairs into an undressing room, and they said, you're going to please remember the number of your hook, because after your shower you'll come out and you'll get your clothes back. And they just calmly took their clothes off, thinking they were going into a room for a shower, and they would go in, and instead of water, we all know now it was gas. And then in Auschwitz, the bodies were taken up by elevator and burned in the crematoria. When I've taken the teens there, the ash from the crematoria was used for fertilizer. There was just so much of it. They was thrown into like these pits, ash pits, and I've taken the kids behind the crematoria, and I said, just look down, and you can see that it's all speckled white. And 70 years later, you can still see the bones. We found a child's tooth. We found part of a spinal cord. We found bones. They're still there, even though you can hear stories that say, there were no crematoria that actually did anything to the Jews. These are just stories that the Jews put together. All you have to do is just visit the place, and it's just horrifying. It's just creeping. So my father, as I said, he was sent up to one of the camps. My mother and her brother had the same reaction. We'll just go to the border with Russia, and we will also just stay there and wait till the war's over. So they said to my grandmother, we're just going to hang out a while. So she gave them some jewelry. She says, in case you need to buy food or whatever. But I'm not going. The Germans in World War I were, they never did anything terrible to us. We're just going to hang out. I don't want to leave the store. I don't want to leave my house. All my things. I have so many things. So they didn't want to leave. My mother left with her brother, and they heard stories of that times were not going to be good. So Hanukkah of 1939, she made it back to Lodz, and she said to her mother, well, you've got to leave. And the mother says, I'm not leaving, you just go. So my grandmother took my mother to the train station, and my mother went as a Gentile. She did not have her band with the Star of David on it, but my grandmother did, and took my mother to the train station, and my grandmother's shawl was covering her Star of David, and a German was walking by, a soldier, saw that my grandmother's Star of David was covered, and my mother was on the train already looking out the window, and the last thing she saw of her mother was she was being beaten by the German for covering up her Star of David. So she and her brother were arrested as well by the Russians and sent to a camp called up in Siberia called Syktyvkar, and it was a very, 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 very difficult few years there. She was sent to do the cutting of redwood trees. Now here, what experience did she have? She was just young. She's 25 years old, and here she was said, okay, here's one of these saws, you 2 people saw, and go out and cut redwood trees. And so a lot of people didn't make it. They wanted to send her to another camp, but not if she was married. The Russians wanted to replenish all the people they lost in World War I. So my mother, one day, she went in and she was delivering some lumber into this, I guess, factory, and she met this nice-looking man who happened to be my father, and she said to him, where are you from? Where are you from? And they found out that they lived fairly close to each other in Poland, and she said, do me a favor, will you marry me? And he said, I got a girlfriend back home. I'm going to go back home. And she said, but listen, I got a boyfriend back home. But in the meantime, we'll probably never make it out of here. So my uncle married them. And they were given a barrack. They were given this hut to live in. And what it consisted of was there was a big oven in the center, and half of it was they set up these crates to sleep on, and the other side was a woman, and her job was to mate goats. So that's what she did on her side of the hut, and she slept on that center oven. about a year and a half later, my mother finds that she's pregnant with me. And there's just no, women aren't having any children there because it's, you know, the food just didn't allow them to procreate. So I'm anxious to come out, and May 2nd of 1944, a little girl is born up in the camp up there. And what do you do with me? There's no baby clothes, there's no diapers, there's no cribs, there's nothing. And so my father wrapped me in a pillow, and they trudged home to this makeshift barrack over there, and we stayed there for a couple months. My father had a beautiful voice, and a lot of the people that were arrested were also from the Moscow Opera House, and he asked if he could join in, and they accepted him, and he was able to get a little bit more food for my mother and therefore with me. Eventually, the Germans now, because it's really the end of the war, the Germans are losing. They're retreating from Russia, and as they retreat, they burn everything. They burn everything in Ukraine, and Ukraine was the breadbasket of Russia and the whole area. So they wanted to move some of the slave labor from Siberia down to the Ukraine to help rebuild Ukraine. And we were on that transports of the railroad, the cattle trains going down from Siberia down to the Ukraine to help rebuild it. And while we were there, it took about a month, and there was a lot of problems. I got very sick. I nearly died on the trains. It was not a good voyage at all. We stayed in the Ukraine till the end of the war, and then we tried to make it back to our hometowns in Poland from the Ukraine. And when it was really heartbreaking to find out when you get to the towns and your cities, and you start hearing the stories of what happened to your family, or not hearing what happened to your family. So when my father got back and he found out that of his 7 siblings, the 2 oldest had survived, and they were already in Germany in the displaced persons camps. And so he wanted to go there. My mother found out that she had 2 brothers, and that had survived, and they went to Israel. So she wanted to go to Israel. So it was going back and forth, and the decision was made to go. And my mother said, "Well, I want to go see my house. I want to see my mother," before she made this decision. And my mother went to her house, and she knocked on the door, and she expected my grandmother to open the door. And the door opened a crack, and inside was the gardener. And he said, "What are you doing alive? Don't you know everybody is dead? Your whole family is dead." And my mother passed out. And because I was a year and a half and I was crying for her, she got up and she said, "Well, I'm gotta take care of my child." And So we needed people needed to locate anybody else that was alive in their families. And so we went and we went to the DP camp in Germany. And that's my first remembrance of when I was there. Prior to that, I was obviously too young. So we waited for a visa to come to the United States, and we had to live in Germany for 3 years. And those were the years that my first recollections were. And then we were put on a Navy vessel in March of 1949, and we came to this country after 10 days with $10, no job, no apartment. Obviously didn't have, we didn't know English, and yet this is the life, it's to start out with in this country. It was very, very difficult, and there were no jobs to be had because the soldiers were getting the first jobs, and the apartments were given to the soldiers that were returning, and it was very, very difficult times, I remember. I started school, and I'll end very soon. I started school in first grade. I didn't know, obviously, English, and we didn't have any money. So I was wearing, the clothes was still from Europe, and the kids in first grade didn't want to play Ring Around a Rosie with me. We were playing. So I remember the teacher taking my hands, and then we were sitting in the classroom, and the teacher would ask the question, and I must have raised my hand and answered, and the kids, as kids do, went hysterical laughing at me because I sounded very funny. And it was such a deafening sound that laughter made that it was imprinted on my brain for all of elementary school, middle school, high school, and college. I never raised my hand in class again, ever. And the only time I was able to speak again and not worried about people laughing at me is when I went on the March of the Living, on the first march, and I stood near the gas chamber and the crematoria, the ovens, and I felt in my heart, I felt my grandmother talking to me. And she said, "You speak for me. You be my voice. I don't have a voice anymore. You tell the story of what happened to me and the children." And I came back from that march, and I went to my synagogue, and I said to the rabbi, "Can you call an assembly? I want to speak to this school." Now, this was unheard of. Here was a person, me, who didn't speak, and I asked to speak to the group because I was speaking for her, to tell what happened to her, what happened to the children. And I continued after that. That was what drove me to be involved with Jewish education, and continues to be, something that's a driving force for me to this day. And the importance of telling the story is paramount. And I thank you for inviting me. Questions? Yes.
So go back a little bit if you don't mind. Thank you for
Yeah.
sharing your incredible story. You're extremely courageous, and we all appreciate it. I wasn't able to get every detail, but could you go back to the time of when you said that there was the part where somebody had a girlfriend and then you said they might not make it out alive? I just want to clarify that part.
Yeah, that was my parents. My mother was going to be sent to a camp further north, and so she needed to marry somebody, and she met my father, and she said, do you mind getting married? And I tell you, they were the most mismatched couple possible. They would never have gotten together, and they lasted 61 years, which is another miraculous thing. There wasn't one day where they said the same thing agreed upon anything.
So
Never.
arranged marriage.
It was
They stayed together for 61 years.
61 years they're together. I think he was just afraid to leave.
I have a question.
She would
So,
kill him.
When you were on the March of the Living and you had that spiritual awakening experience,
Yes,
was that your first March of the Living?
yes.
And then did you have any?
1988.
And did you have any other spiritual experiences on your other trips back?
No, that was yeah, that was an eye-opening for me. I found like my purpose in life. This is what I have to do. Oh, there's one funny story. When my father agrees to marry my mother in Siberia, and he wakes up after the next morning after they get married, my mother wakes up and she's laying on the, these crates that my father had made. My father's not there. And so she starts looking for him. I mean, she just got married. So she couldn't find him. She went around all over. She couldn't find him. She went over to the commandant of the camp and said, I can't find my husband. So he says, well, he can't be very far. He has to be in the camp. So they walked around. They went all over. Couldn't find. Finally, he says, well, there's only one more place. One more place. There's a train at the station we're recruiting for the Polish army. We're recruiting people. So my father joined the Polish army. So right the day after he got married, just to get away from her. She never let him live it down.
Did he know Polish and Yiddish too?
My father spoke 5 languages.
Wow.
And had the voice of a cantor, which is now in my grandchildren. And my granddaughter is Elphaba in Wicked on Broadway.
Really?
So, yeah, so the voice has been passed down. Yes.
Yeah. So when you came to the United States, where was the first place you lived?
New York.
New York. So when did you come to Florida?
Came to Florida in 91.
Oh, that's where my grandparents came.
Really?
Yeah. Mystic Point, Aventura, tallest building, Turnberry Isle. They wanted to put a satellite on top to spy on the Cubans and Fidel Castro.
In 91?
Yeah.
Oh, that's so funny. We moved to the Bronx. I mean, you moved to the poorest section. We had literally, Hayas gave each adult $10. So my mother had $10, my father had 10. We had $20 to start life with.
What most went to Washington Heights? That's where my grandparents went. Washington Heights. Yeah.
Oh no, we were in the Bronx, and but I tell you, education was foremost for my parents. I was sent to a Talmud Torah school, which cost my parents, I think, $1.50 a month or something. But right away they insisted I, get educated. And that's what they did. We never went on welfare. My sister is an attorney. I became a school director. I mean, all of us, did something with our lives. So,
I have a question.
Sure.
A lot of survivors didn't talk about the Holocaust in the beginning. What was with your parents? Were they open about it from the beginning, or when did it happen?
when the refugees came, and they started in 47 to come here, the American Jews in particular did not want to hear the stories. They didn't want to hear. Don't tell us. Now, whether it was out of guilt, whether they just didn't believe it, they just didn't want to hear it. So the refugees kept their stories to themselves. And one of the first books on what happened was in 1960, when you start having the door open a little bit, and that was Elie Wiesel's book, Night. So that's when you start having, but all through the 50s, it was a very quiet time. In addition, there were some people who did things during the war that they were a little ashamed of, and they didn't want to talk about it. And you can understand. I had one of our leaders on the march. His mother, all the years, said when she was sent to Auschwitz, she was put into the first building on the left. It meant nothing to him. When we got to Auschwitz, he found out it was the brothel.
The Bravo?
Brothel.
Brothel.
Did she want to talk about that? You know? So there's a lot of stories. People did a lot of things, you know. They would grab food from each other, and the other person would die so that they could. People did a lot of things to live, and sometimes they didn't want to share those stories.
What was the city that you were originally from? What was it called?
Where I was born was in Syktyvkar. Syktyvkar, Kami, Asasir, Siberia. Yes.
I just want to comment. We're both children of Holocaust survivors.
Yeah.
And we had very different experiences. Her father actually wrote a book in detail of what happened, right? Your dad wrote a book.
No, he never wrote a book.
What was that book? What was the book that he pulled up?
He has
not
not
Rabbi
notation.
That was Rabbi Weitzman that wrote that book.
Did he? Your dad's very The experience I had, my parents wouldn't tell me anything. And we got little bits and pieces, and it was only like pulling things out. And my daughter.
You know why? They didn't want to hurt you.
That's right.
They didn't want to upset you, so they didn't. Just like I couldn't ask my parents too many details because they would cry at the questions. So my husband asked them questions, and then he would tell me.
So I was going to say, you have such wonderful details, and it's so important for you to tell the story for the next generation and the next generation, because the older ones are dying out. There's no one to tell the story. So it's wonderful that you've got this mission.
Yeah.
I used to work as a case manager for the Holocaust program in Florida, in the Fort Lauderdale area. So I know that through Germany there were reparations paid to survivors. Did you and your family?
No, because we were in Russia.
So when you came to New York, there were
No reparations. Oh, anyone in Russia, we're no reparations.
You might be eligible now.
No.
No?
Mm-mm. Because who's going to give them? Germany?
Yeah.
No, but not for the Russians. Not if you were hiding in Russia or you were interred in a camp in
Russia, no.
in Poland.
Lawyers that we could contact.
Yes, and I have them in my
There's
family.
some second, third generation, and fourth generations that would be happy to represent you.
Yeah.
I worked with like 90% of the clients that I worked with were, they were either from Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, Poland.
But where did they spend the war?
All received reparations.
But if they spent the war in Germany, in one of the camps in Germany or in Poland, yes. But
No,
a child Holocaust survivor was from Belarus. She received protection.
From Belarus, but where did she spend the war?
Well, the Nazis invaded Belarus when
Yes.
she was 5, and they escaped to Uzbekistan. And then they came back, and of course they were probably in the Russian government. So they were,
Alright, I have a question.
You do?
I have precedence. What did you do before you had your spiritual awakening and shifted to Jewish education?
I didn't speak.
What do you do for a living? Like, what was?
I graduated Hunter College in New York in education, and I was petrified of the idea of going into a classroom. Luckily, I got married as a senior in college and had a baby right away and got out of teaching because I could not teach. I could not teach. I'm going to stand in front of a class? Are you kidding? And they're going to laugh at me?
Did you teach after you had your epiphany in '88?
After that, yes. Then you couldn't keep me down. Yes. Yes, yes.
My father was a lieutenant in the Russian army. After war. Russian army. Okay. They were, yes. And all of our families, my mother and my father were actually first cousins. A lot of that, like, she's telling stories of what happened. A lot of that happened, and it's just funny how she talks about how her parents were not a match. People married people just because they were alone and they wanted somewhere to go and someone to be with.
My parents too.
What?
My parents too, they met after the
Right.
war.
But that was the case with my parents. They were in love. But that was good. But also, my mother lost everybody in the war. All 3 brothers. Her parents. And she was saved by her Polish friend. Parents. The father was actually a collaborator with the Nazis. Okay? He was a lawyer or a judge or a lawyer, and he was the person that turned in Jews. But when my mother came to the door, because they loved her, they saved her by taking her in and getting her papers. Her name was Sabina, but she became Stefka and had these papers, and then she had to leave there. And many years later, okay, so talk about how they didn't want to talk about it. When they did come to Canada, my mom had family in New York, which is funny because they contacted me recently, and she went to New York and she wanted to tell the story right after the war.
Yeah,
And nobody wanted to hear. When you said that, I just remember my
that's
mother.
true. Nobody wanted to hear.
So after that, she wouldn't talk about it for years and years, and I was always the one who wanted to know. When you're 10, when you're 13, when you're 16, when you're 20. Anyways, when I was in my 30s, and I was going through some issues, and I was seeing a psychologist, and that's the first time I heard my mother's story. My father talked about the war a lot, but not in detail of the story, how it happened, like you know how yours happened. And so he would just talk about the heroic story, which is a very good story, but a bad story, where him and my uncle survived. He and my uncle and my auntie survived. And my uncle and my father were together in the forest. And my dad stabbed the Nazi and killed him. And it sounds like a movie, but I grew up living this all my life because my father talked about it. And my father couldn't swim. And my uncle swam the river with the 2 of them, and they were shooting at them. And they survived in the forest. It was later, okay? They all were in the same ghetto as you were describing because they were in the same town and they were related. And on the same night, there were a few other people that were killed different ways. Like my grandmother, my great-grandmother was shot in front of my mother and the entire family. These are the real stories, and you know this. With a bazooka bullet. Does anybody raise your hand if you know what a bazooka bullet is? Yeah, she exploded all over the wall. This is what people need to know, okay? True. Anyways, so my mother survived and my father survived, okay? And they were passing each other in wagons, okay, going both ways. And so my father in the forest, my mother lived as a non-Jew and wore a cross to survive after they saved her, okay? And my father saw her and grabbed her off the wagon and said, "There's our little cousin Sabina." And grabbed her and he said, "You're our cousin Sabina." And she said, "No, I'm Stefka." She thought she would live as a non-Jew the rest of her life. And he yanked the cross off of her neck and he said, "No, you're not. You're a Jew. Come with me." That's how their love story began. And again, the family in New York, nobody really wanted to hear about it. But when I was in my 30s, my mother told me her story of survival and how they were all killed, and she survived in a box of, this is the beginning of her survival, in a box of light bulbs. She was very tiny. And everybody else was killed, okay, all in the town. And the Nazis were not just Germans. No offense to anybody who's a German or Ukrainian or anyone who's anything else here, but the Ukrainian people and the Polish people were terrible people too. If you were a killer, you were a killer. And if you weren't a killer, you weren't a killer. That's how it was told to me. And so 2 Ukrainian policemen found her in the glass box of light bulbs. And anyways, I'm not going to go into what happened after that because it's personal. But at the end, they said, "We're going to let you go now." And they told her, "You can walk." So she had to walk, if you can imagine this. You're 13 or you're 16 or whatever she was, 13. And thinking they're going to shoot you in the back. And she kept walking and she kept walking. And they never shot her. And they spared her. And so then she went to the family that saved her. And so when I was 36 or 7, I heard this story. And I'm not going to take up any more time talking, but there's way more to the story. But to tell you that after that, I swore that there would be some documentation of my parents' story, because I waited to hear my mother's story, and then I connected it all. But when Steven Spielberg did the Shoah tapes shortly after that, I insisted that my parents do them. And it's unbelievable now that they're both gone, obviously. But I have these Shoah tapes. And in the Shoah tape, my mother tells the same story. And then my father tells his version of the story. And when we watch these tapes, which we haven't shown them to too many people because my mom never wanted anyone to see them while she was alive. So recently, my family, my cousins, their parents never did the Shoah tapes. They were either deceased or they didn't want to. But I have these tapes where my father's talking the same way that he always talked and told stories, and he's telling the story, and my mother as well. So there's very few survivors left, especially in that age bracket. You were a 1.5-year-old, so you're young still, and so are my cousins. My cousin, well, Izzy was born in Europe.
Molly.
Molly was born. Molly's probably about the same age as you, and I have a few cousins who were born just like you during the war. But I don't know if you know this part to the story, which you probably do, but sadly there were very horrific things that went on for survival and everything. There was a whole thing that, like, for example, you were hiding in a bunker where you were like people like the size of like half an elevator, and you're all against the wall. And a child starts crying, and they had to suffocate the child so all these people would survive. It's awful.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. But if we're here today to pass on this story, we need to pass on the story so that people will know that this really happened. They denied it happened. There's Holocaust deniers and anti-Semites everywhere. And I'm already going to be, I won't tell you how old, but I'm over 50. So it's up to you guys to make sure that it's never again, that the stories are told, that you get a hold of show and tapes, that you tell people what really, really happened so that people will know. Anyway, there's way more, but that's the end of my part.
Thank you for
Thank
sharing
you.
that story. We're gonna wrap it up.
Yeah.
We have a- Is it?
One last
Okay.
Just because I watched I don't know if you're aware of the rally in New York, the Freedom Rally against the mandates with the vaccine. There was a Holocaust survivor that was speaking at that rally. I had a friend who was attending, so she sent me the video. Do you see any similarities between what happened in the Holocaust and what happened in the past 3 years?
That's interesting. What are the similarities?
That's what I'm at.
Mandating a vaccine?
Question.
Like the.
I know it's kind of a shotgun question.
It's not,
but,
it's, what she's saying is that people are being forced to do things whether they want to or they don't, just like the Jews were forced to do certain things and not given the option. And she's asking you if you
I don't,
feel similarities
No.
or the comparison.
I think, I think you need to keep the Holocaust separate from any type of similarity for anything else. It was a very unique time and place and everything else that was involved with it. When they use the word Holocaust describing other things that are happening or happen to other people, it's also something I disagree with. So it should be just, that's why they changed it to the word Shoah, you know, to make it more, it's a very unique thing, and yet there are universal lessons to come out of it that needs to be looked at. What's frightening to me is the rise of anti-Semitism that's so great right now, and it's very scary. And you know, I'm asked, do you think it can happen again? And I always have said no, but you know what? I'm not sure. I'm not sure. So it's when you have this amount of anti-Semitism, when the world situation is not the way it was when the Nazis began, you know, what's behind it? You're getting now a mixture of, you're mixing anti-Israel and anti-Jewish, are getting all mixed together now into one, and it's worrisome. And I think we all need to be very aware and alert that it happened before and it can happen again. And that's, I'll leave you with that.